Who was the mysterious Robert Mills? Hi, in this ancestry video, we delve further into the life of my paternal great-great-grandfather, Robert Mills. Robert is the earliest of my ancestors that I've been able to find that shares my surname, Mills. For a better understanding of how he sits in the family tree, I recommend you watch day 4 in my Ancestry Road Trip video series before you watch this video. When I began researching my family tree, I initially had no information about Robert Mills. However, through Ancestry.com and Trove.com, I was able to gather several details about his life up until his sudden death on Saturday, the 24th of September, 1864. The first piece of information I have on Robert is the official transcript of the coronial inquest into his death, which took place about 2 days later. The first part of the transcript includes the testimony of Robert's second wife, Isabella, who was at home at the time of his death. In it, she describes how Robert took his own life by consuming strychnine shortly after returning home from spending 2 days drinking at a public house in Winslow. It reads, "I am the widow of the deceased and reside at the Kilmorey station near Woolsthorpe. On Thursday last, Mr. Stevens, the overseer at the station, gave liberty to the deceased, who was then complaining of not being well, to go and see a medical man. The deceased returned on Monday morning about 6 o'clock. I was not up at the time. I had not been very well on Saturday and had sent for him to the public house kept by Mr. Burke at Winslow. When the deceased arrived, he inquired if I was better, and then he lay down on a bed in the room. He told me he had come home to die. I asked if he would have some tea, and he said he did not want any tea, but to bring him a cup of water. I took him the water, and he told me to go outside and shut the door of the bedroom, that he wanted to be quiet. I did not suspect at the time that he was going to take poison. About 10 o'clock I went into the room. I saw a bottle containing strychnine on the table. The bottle now produced is the same. It had no label. I asked him what he was going to do with it. He said he had taken some and was going to bid me goodbye. He appeared at the time very much flushed in the face. I went out directly and called a carpenter named William Keeler, who was working outside, and told him what had occurred. He told me that he did not think it was the effects of the poison, but from his having been drinking 2 or 3 days. I asked him again if he had taken the poison, and he said he had, and I then sent away for Mr. Stevens and Alexander Scott, in the deceased having told Scott that he had taken the strychnine. Mr. Stevens went to Warrnambool for a doctor. I mixed up some mustard, but he would not take it for an hour. About 11 o'clock, spasms came, and during the fits he became black in the face. He breathed very hard and frothed at the mouth. He continued getting worse till about 1 p.m, when he died in one of his fits. He was sensible to the last, was sorry for what he had done, and prayed for mercy and forgiveness. I did not scold him when he came home from drinking. I only told him that he ought not be spending his money at the public bar, but I believe he had taken the strychnine before then. I was present at his death. Isabella Mills, ex her mark. Obviously, learning his son was missing, presumed drowned, had a deep impact on Robert's state of mind at the time. But was this enough to push him over the edge? Drinking heavily wouldn't have helped, but why was he so remorseful? Chances are we'll never know. The next piece of information I have on Robert is his burial record, which puts his age at between 34 and 35 at the time of his burial at Woolsthorpe Cemetery. It also tells us he was born in Liverpool, Merseyside, England in 1829, and that he was buried without an undertaker. Last piece of information I have on Robert is his official death record, which puts his age at 38, not 34 to 35. It also records his father and mother's names as John and Catherine Mills, Catherine's maiden name being recorded as Curtis. His father's occupation is listed as sailor. It also reiterates Robert's birth location as Liverpool, England, and quite remarkably that prior to his death he had spent the last 36 and a half years in the Australian colonies, time in each unknown. If true, this means Robert would have been only 1.5 years old when he arrived in Australia in the year 1826, presumably with his parents John and Catherine. We also discover at the time of his death, Robert left 6 children behind, 5 from his first marriage to Sarah Elizabeth, maiden name unknown, and one to his second wife Isabella, maiden name McRae. Sadly, about 10 days after Robert's death, the body of Alfred, his son, is found floating face down in the Merry River, a few miles downstream from where he was last seen fishing. On the 7th of October 1864, Alfred is interned in the Warrnambool Cemetery following a coronial inquest into his death. To date, these are the only verifiable sources of information I've been able to find relating to Robert Mills. So this is where things get a bit mysterious regarding Robert's past life. For starters, despite extensive research of Australian and English records, I have not yet been able to find any information that verifies Robert's date or location of birth, his marriage to Sarah Elizabeth, or the birth of his children to his first wife. On one hand, this may question the accuracy of Robert's death and burial records. On the other, it is understandable given that when Robert's parents allegedly arrived in Australia in 1826, there were only a few small European settlements across the continent. Many of these were penal colonies, with a limited number of free settlers, while others were focused on whaling and sealing activities where sailors formed communities and families. Warrnambool and Port Fairy were among these early settlements founded in the early 1800s. This presents several possibilities regarding Robert's past. Could Robert's parents have been convicts? While uncommon, there were instances where in the early years of transportation, convicted husbands and wives were sent to Australia with their children. But to date, I've found no evidence supporting this possibility when it comes to Robert and his family. Another possibility is that Robert's father, John, was a whaler and sealer, moving between the settlements in line with seasonal migration and other economic factors associated with the whaling industry. This would explain why Robert's death record stated he had spent 36 and a half years in the Australian colonies, time in each unknown. This would also explain the absence of his birth records. Early whaling settlements were small, isolated and often temporary. They didn't have the same level of formal organisation as established towns, and government presence in some whaling areas was limited, making it harder to enforce record-keeping practices. Another explanation is that, for reasons unknown, Robert changed his name to hide his identity. This possibility, though it seems remote, was raised in an interesting article published in the Warrnambool Advertiser in 1872, some 7 years after Robert's death, which makes some remarkable claims about his life. Here is an extract from that article. In 1859, at Kilmorey Station, Spring Creek near Winslow, Robert Mills was married to Isabella McRae, by a Wesleyan clergyman, the said Robert Mills being a widower, his first wife being Catherine Curtis. She had 7 children, 6 of whom were alive at the time of his second marriage. He was a man of dissolute habits, fond of associating with the lowest people, yet in his sober moments showed he had moved in a different sphere, could speak fluent French, was a good singer, and a capital horseman. One day, after his second marriage, as he was going away from home, as was his custom periodically, he told his wife if anyone called and asked for Tom Castro, to say that she did not know anything about such a man. Again, he said he had been wrecked in the Bella, coming from Valparaiso, and was one of 3 days on an island without food, and was saved by tying a red shirt on an oar, in consequence of which he always wore a red shirt. On another occasion, he told his wife he had married her under an assumed name. Once he casually mentioned his acquaintance of Lord Bellow. This Bob Mills also had emblems of faith, hope and charity tattooed on his arm and the initials RTC. His body lies interred at Spring Creek near Winslow alongside his first wife, and his secret dies with him. End of quote. Although not stating it explicitly, the article insinuates that Robert Mills was the young missing English lord Roger Charles Tichborne, who went missing, presumed drowned, after the ship he was travelling in, the Bella, went down in a storm off South America on the 20th of April 1854. Following his disappearance, Roger's mother refuses to believe he is drowned and posts a huge reward following rumours that several passengers and crew from the shipwrecked Bella had survived and were picked up by a ship bound for Melbourne. In 1865, a man named Thomas Castro appeared in Australia claiming to be Tichborne. Castro's claim was supported by Tichborne's mother, but the rest of the family was very sceptical. The case went to trial in 1871 and became a cause célèbre in Victorian England. After a lengthy trial, Castro was found to be an impostor and was convicted of perjury. The trial was such a sensation, dignitaries from all over Europe attended to get a glimpse of the accused. It was so popular that a lifelike resemblance of Tom Castro was one of the top exhibits at Madame Tussaud's Wax Museum in London. All up, the trial lasted 288 days and remains one of the most famous cases of disputed identity in history. Initially, the article published in the Warrnambool Advertiser had me intrigued. Could this be true? Unfortunately, I must admit, further research revealed that although Roger Tichborne and Robert Mills were roughly the same age, Robert was living in Woolsthorpe with Sarah and their 4 children at the time Roger was shipwrecked. It remains a mystery as to why a small regional newspaper would publish an article like this and why they chose Robert Mills as its subject some 7 years after his death. I can only speculate that the story may have come from Robert's second wife, Isabella, who was possibly working as a servant in Warrnambool at the time, before moving to Clifton Hill, Melbourne, where she died in 1891. The most likely reason for the article is that the Roger Tichborne trial had just come to a conclusion at the time this article was published, and anything to do with the case was of extreme interest all over the world. Even if it wasn't based on fact, it helped sell newspapers. Having exhausted the historical records, my next line of inquiry to discover the origins of my great-great-grandfather Robert Mills was to try and trace my DNA to other ancestors on Ancestry.com. Unfortunately, this also proved unsuccessful. Despite repeated attempts to find DNA matches with the surname Mills, I started to wonder whether Robert did indeed change his name before his first marriage to Sarah. Until recently, I just happened to stumble across the following death record for a John, no surname, with a spouse listed as Catherine Curtis and a child listed as Robert Mills. Not long after this, I also discovered a similar death record for a Catherine Curtis, spouse named John and child Robert Mills. There are also several strange things about these records. Firstly, they don't provide a surname for the spouse John, although it can be assumed from the child's surname of Mills. Secondly, Catherine's surname is listed as Curtis and not Mills, which could suggest they weren't married when they died. Thirdly, they are listed as having only the one child at the time of their death. This seems rather unusual given that during these times of no contraception, family sizes were much bigger. The Ancestry.com website says these records are sourced from their Pioneer Index of Victoria 1836 to 1888, which in turn is sourced from the Australian Death Index from 1787 to 1985. It also notes that the original data for this index is compiled from publicly available sources. Unfortunately, my investigations to uncover exactly where this public information is sourced have also been unsuccessful, but investigations continue. If I can nail down the origins of this information, there's a good chance I'll uncover the mystery of who was Robert Mills and discover my earliest paternal ancestor to visit and call Australia home at the same time. Keep a lookout for further video postings on this subject. But until then, see ya.